This prayer is a poem. It is from Wendell Berry, and it's called The Peace of Wild Things. Let us pray. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in my fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. Thank you, Emily. Come on in. Find a seat wherever you have one, and we will get more if we need them. To me, this speaks of how peaceful, how giving our land is to us and to all the creatures of the earth, how important it is and to know about the story of our land. And so that is what Elke and Lathram and Albert are going to share with us this evening and also next week. I think that most of you have some Post-its and pens, and you'll be given direction for those, but also feel free to use them to jot down notes or write down questions that you may have along the way. So without further ado, I'm going to let Lathram take it from here, or Elke.
Right. Wonderful. Before I begin, who does not have a cup of soil, either with them or with a seatmate that you could share? Does everyone have access to the cup of soil? Yes? Are we good? Wonderful. Okay. If you find out that you don't have any, or your neighbor isn't being neighborly and not sharing, then I have some more up here. Okay, well, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Just a few little bits of context before we get into getting ourselves centered and grounded in what we're about to share. We want to recognize that everyone here comes from different lineage, different story, different ancestry, race, class. We all hold different things, and we want to be able to be in a space where we can share that and share that in love and kindness with one another. And as we listen to these stories, we'll be hearing things that aren't part of our lineage or story, but that's what we're wanting to do, is expand on what we know. So before we get into that, I'd like to have my partners up here share a little bit about who they are and what their story is, and how they intersect with the stories of the land.
You want to start? I'll start. We're going to share a little bit about who we are.
Okay. Yeah.
You can start.
My name is Albert Bender, and I'm a Cherokee Indian. And to give a little bit of information on myself, I'm an attorney, retired attorney, and I put that, preface that by saying I'm in active retirement. I'm the chairperson of the Indigenous Peoples Coalition based in Nashville. And I've been an attorney for different tribes in different parts of the country, including Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico. And myself and other members of the Native community, we've been very much involved in Native American community issues, combating development, fighting for the preservation of ancient Native American burial sites and other ancient sites that go back thousands of years. And we will continue to do so, and I'm very gratified to see such a goodly number of people here tonight. And that kind of concludes my introduction of myself.
Thank you. I'm Lathram. I grew up in Franklin, Tennessee, about 20 minutes south. have called Nashville home again for the last 3 years. I grew up upper class, technically ruling owning class when you break down class analysis deeper than what we know or usually talk about. My ancestors settled in the U.S. in the late 1700s in Middle Tennessee and in Muskogee lands of South Alabama. And that legacy continues today. My paternal lineage, they have developed 600 acres in Franklin. And my maternal lineage owns 300,000 acres in the state of Alabama that drills for oil and timber. So I come to this work with a lineage of settlers, a lineage of people that have enslaved other people, and believe that touching that pain, getting close to understanding where harm has been, where harm has occurred, is how we can all heal together.
And I'm Elke Hoffman. I am a German-Filipino immigrant. A lot of my ancestry has been erased, and I have grown up with very little connection to place and who am I's, because I did not have a connection to my Filipino family, and there was a lot of erasure on the German side. When we immigrated here, I spent a lot of time in the environmental science world because my dad was an environmental scientist, and I had a deep appreciation for care of earth and the stewardship of earth, but I was lacking what that meant in the interconnectedness of the earth and who I am and how that plays out even in the lineage of my families. And that's how I came into this work, and understanding really how much knowing how we are interconnected with all life is so important for us to be able to move forward in community and to heal the harms that existed both in the places of human life and life on earth. And so that is how I am coming here. One more thing before I move on into grounding. Just want to say that I would love for you all to listen with both your ears and your heart. And when you have an opportunity to speak, we'll have a speaking stick or token. We'll pass that around, and just also speak from your heart at that time as well, knowing that, again, we all come from a different place, we all have a different story, and we want to be able to embrace that in a place of love and care. Okay, why did I ask everybody to have soil? One thing that we like to do, Lathram and I like to do, is actually decenter humans and reconnect us to land in order to really start telling these stories, right? We're in a building, we're not outside. A lot of times we facilitate outside. I would love for us to get our hands a little dirty, dig into the cup, and I'll do this with you. All right, we're going to take the soil in our hands, and I don't mean just a little pinch. I want us to really get the soil in our hands. Feel the soil. Look at it. Take all of our senses. Feel the moisture in the soil. Smell it. I mean, if you're so moved, you can eat it, but that's up to you. But what I want us to do right now is really to start thinking about our interconnectedness to the soil and the stories that are held within this soil. So let's go ahead and close our eyes, if you don't mind. And then I'm going to invite you to get your feet on the floor. Go ahead and plant yourself. Think about your feet as rooting into the soil that's in your hands. Then we're going to take a couple of deep breaths in. We're going to hold the breath in for about 3 seconds. And then let it out. And again, breathe in. And let it out. And as you're breathing and holding this soil, I want you to think about the fact that it takes 500 to 1,000 years for topsoil, nutrient-dense topsoil to form. And that soil is made up of the leaves, trees, bird poop, all these items that fall onto the ground decay and create this dense soil. And this takes a lot of time. There's a lot of stories that are held within this soil, a lot of memories. And so as we're holding this soil and understanding that all of these things have come into the soil to bring life forward, that we are actually holding these memories and stories in our hand right now. And this soil is living. So the stories are still living within this soil that we have in our hands. And that's what we're going to be thinking about today when we think about the stories of the land, who was here before this building, before us, who's still here, and what we need to do to make sure that that stays in community and in healing together. I ask you to take another deep breath in and let it out. Okay. You can come back into place. If you want to, you can keep the soil in your hand while we talk, or just put it back in the cup. We will have, there's a bowl back there that you can clean your hands with at the end of our time together. And just know that all of this will actually go right back into the ground. So even with the water that you're washing your hands, we're going to return that back to the earth where it came from. What we're going to be doing today is similar to co-creating a land acknowledgement. Anyone here know what a land acknowledgement is? Just raise your hand. Would you like to share?
My understanding is it's acknowledging those who have owned the land or lived on the land back many, many years.
Yes, in part, absolutely. It's acknowledging that this land is not ours. This land was someone else's and is still someone else's. It's active. We're going to take that not just as a part of the past in history, but make it present and future going. And as we hear these stories, I want you with your Post-it notes to be kind of taking some notes. How would I create a land acknowledgement based on the stories we're hearing? And then at the end, we have 3 questions over there on the board. And as you're hearing things, we just want to know what's stirring for you. And you'll have some time at the end of our time together to go ahead and write on the Post-it notes in response to those questions up there. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this to Albert. I think we're going to go ahead and start with Albert.
I'm going to read the questions real fast.
Go ahead.
Before I hand it to Albert, I'm going to read the questions so that people can hold them as we talk. How do the stories compare to what you know or have been taught about this time period? How can these histories inform your work? And what is a story in your life that you would like to work to unearth? So as we're talking and as you're listening to each of us and also to each other, you can use some Post-it notes just to take notes of what's rising for you in your heart, in your body, in your mind, and then we'll post them over there. All right, Albert, it's all you.
Oh, thank you. I've been asked if I'd rather sit and make a presentation or whether I'd rather stand at the podium and make a presentation. I think I will stand and make a presentation due to the fact that we have such a large number of folks here today, and again, I'm so gratified to see all of you. Again, as I said, I'm really gratified to see all of you, and from what Elke said about the soil, I can really relate to that because this is my soil. And my soil that goes back ancestrally, I'd say about 14,000 years. And it reminds me, Elke talking about the soil, of a presentation, a venue I was at in Knoxville, Tennessee, last weekend, as a matter of fact. And I was at a venue, a panel discussion, and I was accompanied by two ladies from Cherokee, North Carolina. One was a Cherokee, a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The other one was a Muskogee Creek, who works for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And talking about the soil reminded me of a statement made by Eastern Band Cherokee member Kimberly Smith, because she talked about how that when she has a garden at Cherokee and raises crops, corn, beans, and squash, she thinks about the ancestors who are buried in the soil, and she looks upon it as the crops that are growing from the soil are coming from the dust of the ancestors that are in the soil. And this is something that really struck home with me in terms of our connection for Native American people, our connection to the land, and hopefully that all of you will feel the same connection to the land. And I was asked at the panel discussion, each of us were asked this question: how do you feel, or what is your strong connection to the land, and how does that manifest itself? And I answered the question by saying that my connection with the land keeps me fighting for the preservation of the land, fighting for the green spaces, fighting for the grass, fighting for the trees, fighting for the animals and insects that live on the land. And in the Native American way, everything has life. Trees have life, rocks have life, grass has life. And I particularly was struck by thinking in terms of when I was growing up as a young boy. My family did a lot of farming, raised corn, beans, squash, melons. My family also did a lot of hunting and fishing and gathering. And as I grew older and became more aware of a lot of things politically, I thought to myself that we were engaged in what you would call a subsistence type of existence. We farmed to live, we hunted and fished to live, and we gathered the produce, the wild produce of the land to live. And again, these are very strong connections that go back thousands of years. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is, and this is something that is still a developing story, so to speak. I'm going to talk about the ancient inhabitants of the land and the glorious, glorious civilizations that existed in Middle Tennessee, and in particular in Nashville, and also about the glorious civilizations 1,000 years ago that existed throughout all of the eastern part of North America. The indigenous civilizations of eastern North America were equal to, and this is something that everybody should realize, were equal to the civilizations of the Aztecs and the Mayas in Central America. These ancient civilizations were among the greatest and most brilliant in the entire world at the time, thousands of years ago. Millions of inhabitants lived throughout this part of the eastern half of North America, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, from the Atlantic coast all the way to the edge of the Great Plains in eastern Oklahoma. The ancient Mississippian cities were larger than London or Paris at the time. London had maybe about 200,000 people, equal for Paris. The Aztec civilization of Tenochtitlan had about 250,000. This land was a paradise, an Eden, so to speak. There was no disease. It's estimated that prior to or at the time of European contact, first European contact on the shores of North America, that there were 60 million, and keep this in mind, 60 million indigenous inhabitants in the area of what is now the United States. And to give you an idea of the genocide that took place, by the year 1900, from being at a high number of 60 million, there were only 237,196 indigenous Native Americans left within the entire expanse of the United States. And I always find that a shocking figure. But to go back to the ancient civilizations that existed, there were millions and millions of people living in these areas from all over, and there were vast, vast trade routes, trade networks that traversed the entire area of eastern North America. And these trade networks were considered sacred because anyone who adopted the occupation of trader could travel the trading paths with impunity, without having to worry about their safety. These were called trading paths that were recognized by all tribes. Now, of course, there was some military activity, and you had what were called, and this is not to use a stereotyped term, but actually paths of war, or war paths, so to speak. And in the Cherokee lexicon, these were called the paths of the armed ones. But there was still so much more trading than warfare. The trading pretty much preempted a lot of military activity. I want to give an overview first of Mississippian civilization and then focus on the local ancient towns that existed here in the Middle Tennessee area. Again, looking at the extraordinary population decline, and this is something that, again, as I say, is an unfolding story. Every week or two, and I've been studying Native American history all my life, for decades, but there's always something new. New ancient cities are being found even as I speak. Just a couple of weeks ago, online news talked about the finding of the ancient Wichita town in Kansas of Estanzoa. This town had 20,000 inhabitants when the Spaniards first encountered it in the early 1600s. And again, looking at the extraordinary population decline, the Wichita Nation numbered about 200,000 in the 1600s. Shockingly, by 1937, there were only 100 Wichita people left in the entire United States. So again, that just speaks to the extraordinary population decline. But going back to the ancient cities, there was an abundance of great, great cities in every direction. These were encompassed with vast ceremonial complexes, and the DeSoto expedition of 1540 talked about the large populations that they encountered on their piratical plunder of the Southeast. And I'm asked oftentimes, well, what tribe was this that constructed this town or that town? And my research and reflection on it leads me to believe that these were multi-ethnic towns, towns composed of peoples from various tribes speaking a number of different languages. And the way I come to that conclusion is because I've studied the history of ancient Mexico and Guatemala, and places like Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan, and other ancient cities were composed of peoples who spoke different languages. We were all just getting along with one another. And these cities, particularly in the Southeast, Midwest, and Northeast, functioned as city-states. These great cities were filled with millions of people prior to European contact for hundreds of years. And talking about one of the ancient cities is the city of, the ruins of the city of Spiro, which is in southeastern Oklahoma. And this city was one of the great urban centers of ancient North America, with thousands upon thousands of people, dozens of mounds and the like. And there's a lot of literature that's coming out now about that city and other ancient ones. And in terms of, and this is something that I find fascinating too, when you talk about writing systems, tribes throughout the Southeast and parts of the North and Northeast had writing systems. Also, a number of the Plains tribes had writing systems. This brings me to an example of a Kiowa family that I read about. This was in the year 1890. A young Kiowa man was sent to a boarding school back east. And for a long period of time, he didn't have any contact with his family. But his family wrote him a letter in which the means of communication was by pictographic writing. And pictographic writing was developed from the Indian Sign Language of the Plains. And in this pictographic writing, his family told him about the latest news of his brother who had passed away, where his brother was buried, so forth and so on, goings on of a domestic nature at home. And so the administrator of the school, who was a white man, looked at the pictographic writing, which had been used as actually writing script, and asked the young man, to translate it for him, which the young man did. And he explained to the school superintendent that this was a form of pictographic writing that had been taught to him by his grandparents and his parents. And I just find that very fascinating, the ingenuity of reducing sign language to signs on paper as a form of writing. Getting back to what's happening on a local level, and this deals with the east bank of the Cumberland, where there are proposed plans for a great deal of development. But what I want to stress is that all of downtown Nashville sits atop a vast, ancient, indigenous city that existed 1,000 years ago. This city had suburbs of towns, villages, hamlets, and farmsteads with a population of over 1 million right here in Middle Tennessee. And 1,000 years ago, Middle Tennessee had the largest Native American population in the entire Southeast. In fact, a few years ago, an archaeologist stated that so many indigenous people lived here that you could not walk anywhere, including where you're sitting at right now. You could not walk anywhere in Nashville without stepping in the footprints of Native Americans. And this is a very moving thought and something that really needs to be reflected on by those of you who leave here tonight. The population, the ancient population of Nashville is now estimated to have been 1,000 years ago at 400,000. And that's a huge number. And in fact, modern day Nashville did not eclipse the population of ancient Nashville until the year 1963 with a population of over 400,000. Moving along, I want to talk about, again, just the brilliance of ancient Nashville and what are things to be considered, and that the preservation of the ancient sites in Nashville should be an ongoing part of the heritage of all Nashvillians, native and non-native. Because again, these ruins, these ancient cities go back thousands of years. And every now and then, I encounter a little amusement dealing with people in Nashville. I was coming out of the bank a few weeks ago, and this elderly white couple passes by me, and the elderly white man says, "Hey, you're an Indian." I said, "Well, yeah." And so he says, "How long have you been in Nashville?" I said, "Oh, about 14,000 years." But this gets even better. The elderly white lady looks at me and says, "How old are you?" I said, "She couldn't have thought now." No, she couldn't have thought that. But anyway, these are just a few of the things that I wanted to bring to you here tonight. And again, to impress upon you the brilliance and of the antiquity of ancient Nashville. And some of the other things, a couple other things I want to mention is that ancient Nashville abounded in eating implements. The first spork, combination spoon and fork, originated right here in the Cumberland Valley. And this is at a time when most of the rest of the world was eating with its fingers. So there were all types of advancements that ancient Nashville made during the period of 1,000 years ago. And again, this is part of the heritage of all of Nashville, all of Tennessee. And I think that the Nashville sites should be placed on the National Historic Places list. Yeah, as some of the other sites have been in different parts of the country. Okay, and there are other things that I could talk to you about. One thing that I find tremendously fascinating is Cherokee cave art. And Cherokee cave art is art that's put on the inside of caves in different parts of in the cave systems of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama. And I'm not claustrophobic myself, but I've read about how people had to belly crawl to get to these ancient caverns. And this is another thing that I'd like to talk to you about when I have more time, but something else that fascinates me. And I'm going to close at this time, and again, greatly gratified for the size of the crowd today and the interest that you've shown. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. I'm going to build off of that and share a little bit about what that means in present-day context. And then we'll dive into a little bit more around the building that we're in, the streets that we're connected to, and what has occurred in this space. But I just wanted to give a little bit more info on how that has played out. So the Trail of Tears started in 1830. That was not the very beginning. That was the enacted marker by Andrew Jackson. The impacts of that are absurd, which we probably could gather. But this, where we are standing, is the home of many nations, and they were forced into surrounding states. And the way that plays out today is we have no federally recognized tribes in the state of Tennessee, even though this is the home of many people. On the way here, we were talking about people returning home. This is still home. And indigenous peoples are coming back to this place, and it is not something of the past, even though there's a rich history that is ancient. It is ongoing and still existing every day around us. So I also wanted to share, I'm about to talk a little bit about times of enslavement and the legacy of enslavement. But I wanted to start by talking about timelines. So oftentimes when we think about history, we're taught that history is blocked off into different parts and they happened at different times. But the Trail of Tears started in 1830, and during that time people were being enslaved. And the emancipation was in 1863. So all of this was happening at the exact same time. And that is something that I think we don't always know, or aren't always taught, or don't always remember. But these realities are so much closer together than we actually think. And I think that sometimes it's a defense mechanism for us to place it further away, and for us to place it in these boxes that are of the past so that we don't have to touch it. But that's not going to work. That's not going to heal anyone. So we have to touch it, and we have to talk about it. Okay, I'm going to play a recording. This recording is from a white working-class farmer from South Nashville that Elke and I have done some work with. And he's describing buttercups, which are flowers that pop up every year. They've started to pop up early this year, if anyone has seen them. And he's telling a story of buildings on the farm that were home of formerly enslaved peoples. And he's describing how he used to work this farm. And the buildings don't exist anymore, but the flowers pop up. And so he can tell where people were. And I'm going to play it so everyone can hear it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. But it's relevant everywhere, even though it's from a farm in South Nashville. I'm just going to try this.
Well, I'm drawing a blank. The yellow flowers, the buttercups. You see where
On this side of the property?
And over at Evelyn's, there's some in front of her house in the front field where the buttercups grow. You'll know that.
What do the buttercups mean?
Well, that's just flowers that they had around the house in the flower beds or whatever, and they come up every spring. Well, you can tell they just didn't appear there. There was a reason they were planted in bulbs, and that you can kind of tell that that's where the house was.
So the reason that I think that clip of that story is so powerful and important is he's describing something that pops up that tells a story that we're not talking about every day when we pass these things, or the stories that the land holds, that the soil holds, that Elke was describing and Albert that was describing, that exist around us under our feet all the time. And we have to know those. We have to know those. That's part of what our job and journey of stewardship is. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those stories that you maybe know or don't know around us today. And something that we usually like to say is that this is incomplete. So you probably know things that I don't know, and these stories are always going to be unfolding. And I think that's another thing about histories. We want to box it up and think that it is complete, when that can't be true. So the land that we're on right now, we can assume and know that it was part of a plantation in the 1800s. It was part of the plantation, Isaac Franklin, who had 122 acres, and he was one of the richest men and slave traders in the entire Southeast. He enslaved 750 people, and that wealth the legacy of that wealth, we still see that show up today. So Adelcia Ackland married into that family, and we are sitting on Ackland Avenue. And when Isaac Franklin died, she inherited all of that land and 750 people that were enslaved. I think that is really interesting, and those are another example of these stories that are not told. So we're sitting on Ackland Avenue, and we know now, some of us might have already known that, but we know that the street name is probably named after her or someone in their family. And you will notice that all over town, too, that we have street names that are named after people that have these legacies of harm that we're probably not acknowledging or don't know. This plantation was a summer house for them. They had thousands of acres in Louisiana, and this was one of their summer estates. When Isaac Franklin died and his wife inherited all of that made her the richest woman in the state of Tennessee. For a little bit of context, when you think about class analysis and understanding class of people during this time, if you enslaved 20 people, you were part of the planter class, which was the upper class. So this family enslaved 750 people, which we calculated and someone found that puts him into the top 1%. So this legacy of stolen land and stolen people and stolen labor has allowed wealth to accumulate over time. And that legacy still exists today. And similar to what we hear from our friend in this story, we found an article that said that in 1890s, all of the houses occupied by enslaved peoples on the estate had been destroyed. So I think that sometimes it is this idea that if we can't see it, right, then we don't have to look it in the face. But what do we do when the street is named after that person, right? So I'm going to zoom out a little bit more, and I'm going to talk about our neighbors of Edge Hill. I'm sure that folks know some or a lot about Edge Hill, especially if you have existed in this neighborhood for a long time. But I think I want to start by talking a little bit about how Edge Hill became the neighborhood of what it is. So during the Civil War, around 1863, as there were Union forts around Nashville, there were enclaves of communities that were freed formerly enslaved people. They were called contraband camps. Can you raise your hand if you've ever heard that term? Okay, a handful of people. Nice. And so these were pockets of our city where freed people could be more free than they were existing in the Confederacy that surrounded them. And post-Civil War, most of these places became historically black neighborhoods. So if you do an overlay of the historically black neighborhoods of our town, and you do that over sites of contraband camps, then you will find that most of the time those match. And another part of that is that most of the time, those became very rich hubs of culture and business right after. I mean, it took a while to build, but they became rich hubs of culture and business. So when I was learning about Edge Hill, I found that that was true, and that it was a Union hub. We have Fort Negley, and we have Fort Morton, and Fort Casino, and all of those were Union hubs. And shortly after, it was a black hub of business with 15 grocery stores, pharmacies, hardware, clothing stores, and several churches. And eventually, in the 1950s, with urban renewal and the circumstances of time and the legacy of enslavement and the forces of white supremacy that started that process in the beginning, pushed 2,300 people out of Edge Hill. So that was because of the I-65 and I-40 that started to block the neighborhood. And businesses were condemned, and people were pushed out. And we've seen that happen in other pockets of Nashville, too, around the same time and due to highways. And like I said, the legacy of that was 2,300 people being pushed out. But I think the story that we also need to know is the one that is this hub of resistance and this hub of thriving possibilities that existed before that we might not know, and is also something that we aren't often taught when we think about the stories. And so, yeah, I think that it's also still continuing, which I think that we all would probably agree with and know. But this is rooted all the way back to the land grants and to the commodification of land. So land wasn't always seen as something that could be bought and sold and parceled out and extracted for natural resources and built with development. And with settler colonialism, with Europeans, came this new idea of existing with land that made it so that we could do that. And as we go through this process, go through this timeline of how things have become, you can see that you can trace all of these different moments of how that land has been used. And you can see through the timeline how our relationship with land, which is something to take, is mirrored in our relationship with people. And both of those things have to be healed. And yeah, so we see this play out all the time around our city. Albert mentioned the East Bank. And if folks don't know, that is the site of the proposed new stadium where the city wants to spend $2 billion on top of an ancient city that is probably going to displace more people for a stadium that's only 20 years old. So it's all tied to this need and desire to extract and accumulate more. And until we examine that, I don't think that anything is going to be solved. Yeah. Maybe I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Lathram. Yeah, we're going to end today with these stories, the unearthing of things that may have been uncovered with lots and lots of layers. Or maybe this is just an expansion of some history that you've already kind of known, and we've added a little extra to it today. And then next week, we're actually going to talk about what can we do? What can we do to bring about repair, bring healing, bring back reconnection for both the land and the peoples? So that will be what we do next week. But what I'd like to do right now, while we have still, how are we doing, Kate?
We have about 8 minutes.
All right, 8 minutes. We'll open it up right now for some questions, but then we also want to give you all some time to reflect and put some Post-its over there by the board. But I'll go ahead and open it up for questions now, if anyone has any that you'd like to ask these two.
Also, we're recording this, So I'm going to bring you a mic, Gail, so that the recorded later people can hear what you asked.
I have lots of questions, but the one that came to mind when you were talking about enslaved people made me think of the time period when they considered African Americans as 3/5 of a person in the census and the counting. Were Native Americans counted in that way, or were they counted at all, or?
Well, for Native Americans, we weren't granted or considered as being citizens until the Indian Citizenship Act passed in 1924. And your question is very good, because what it relates to tribal sovereignty, and for Native Americans being separate nations, which we consider ourselves, and we are under international law, separate sovereign nations. And as late as World War I, and this is very interesting, when Native Americans volunteered for the U.S. Armed Forces in World War I, we were classified as foreign nationals. Yeah, can you believe that? We were foreign nationals. So I would like to answer your question in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. Are there any sites in Nashville that you can that we can point at and we can honor and we can, do some action to protect some sites in Nashville? Can you think of any sites that we can point at?
Well, one, and this relates to something that I meant to mention in my presentation. Talk about ancient cities. There was a discovery of the ancient vast city of ancient Nashville in 2014 when the Sounds baseball stadium was being constructed. And it was found that there were definite evidences of a huge salt-making industry being conducted at that ancient city, that produced such prodigious amounts of salt that salt was exported throughout the Southeast. And in terms of ancient sites, I would say that there needs to be archaeological excavations done on the East Bank, and I guarantee you'll find evidences of more ancient sites over there. And in the meantime, for those of you that are interested, I've got a few business cards I can give out to you for further contact.
And I will just add that we are 2 months away from the Metro Council having an official timeline by the Titans for the stadium. And so we're working on a very tight timeline, and there has not been an archaeological dig or discovery that has happened yet. So your question is coming at a very great time, too.
Are you speaking of a timeline before they vote on it or before they start digging?
Yeah, it's going through council right now. They will have more clarity on an actual timeline for the stadium being built in 2 months. So right now is the time to voice that you have opposition.
Yeah, I have a question and then I have a statement. My question is, Albert, tell us, is there a way that we can advocate with you next week on Tuesday at 10:30?
Oh, yes, you can. I'm assured that you can be at the legislature next Tuesday at 10:30. I received a call this morning from Representative Justin Jones' office to speak in support of a bill that he's sponsoring to have Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains renamed and given the traditional Cherokee name of Kuwahi, which means mulberry place. So those of you who are available and have the time, I would say be there at 10:30 next Tuesday, and we're going to give them all we've got.
And if you've been watching our legislature, they could certainly use some support. So I think, sorry, don't fire me. Okay. So I think that we're sort of wrapping up on time. But Albert, would you also share a little bit about the Cultural Center? Maybe you could speak, and that might be next week. But also, I'm going to pass around this basket, and we're going to do a love offering for whatever Albert thinks it needs to go to.
I would say, the Native American Indian Association is
If you'll just
and
pass it
has
that way.
been for some years advocating for and trying to raise funds for a Native American Cultural Center. And the land has already been purchased, but there is a struggle to get funding from the legislature. And representatives, which, more than a struggle, downright a toe-to-toe fight to get funding from the legislature for the additional monies needed for the construction of the cultural center. So anything that's raised anytime, anywhere, I will see that it goes to the Native American Indian Association.
Thank you. And we'll have, I know that Kate and I and Lathram and Elke and Albert will put together some resources for you all so that you can have more information and like resource places that are that Albert trusts to be able to look dig deeper into the earth, right? And dig deeper into your stories. Do you all want to tell us what to do with our Post-its, and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah, I think I would just encourage everyone to sit with all of these stories and to come back. We don't want you to leave and take all of this with you and just sit in it without doing anything. Allow it to sit with you and bring you back, and then let's see what we can do together. And before you go, if you'll take a few Post-it notes and spend some time with those questions. And the rest of the Post-it notes that you took notes on, you can keep those for yourself if you want, or you can leave them if you want to share them.
Can you remind them what the questions are really quick?
Yeah.
So how do the stories compare to what you know or have been taught about this time period that we went over? How can these histories inform your work? What is the story in your life that you would like to work to unearth?
I just want to thank our speakers. Thank you, Mr. Bender. Thank you, Elke, Lathram. Thank you so much. Yes, what an honor. Thank you all for coming out tonight. So good to see everyone. We'll see y'all next week, 6 p.m., same place, Parker Hall. And you can put your dirt in the bucket over in the corner table here next to the door.